Well, welcome back. It's a beautiful Sabbath day. Delicious food, spiritual and physical. Good to see you back. In a way, I'm happy and I'm sad. I'm sad because Anchor is coming to an end. And I'm happy because Anchor is coming to an end. It'll be a good rest. 26 sessions, Monday through Sabbath, is a major endeavor. But the Lord is good. The Lord has preserved my voice, and, I feel good. I've gotten up a lot earlier than usual, but the Lord has been good. Well, let me tell you what we're going to study this afternoon. We have 2 sessions together, and we are going to begin on page 723. Of course, this is your second volume of the study notes. And we are not going to be able to finish this lesson in one session. So we are going to finish this in the second session, and then we're going to study the short chapter of lesson 22. It's only 5 pages. So our mission this afternoon is to do lesson 21 and lesson number 22. And if we finish that, I'll be satisfied. Okay, let's bow our heads and have a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for the good physical food that we've been able to enjoy. And thank you for the fellowship, meeting new friends and getting reacquainted with old friends. It's kind of like a little taste of heaven. We ask, Father, that as we study this afternoon, as we're on the final stretch, that you'll be with us. As we have pleaded before for the Holy Spirit, we plead for it once more. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, page 723. Ellen White's view of Daniel 11:40 through chapter 12 and verse 4. A much discussed prophetic passage that Ellen White never quoted or even alluded to is Daniel 11, verses 40 through 45. These verses have always been the subject of a lively discussion among Seventh-day Adventist theologians. Until recent years, most of the theologians agreed that the king of the north in this passage symbolizes the papacy, and the king of the south represents the rise of atheism or secularism at the time of the French Revolution. However, in recent times, a new view has appeared on the horizon that sees radical Islam, perceived as the king of the south, playing a significant role in the fulfillment of this prophecy. Those who have embraced this view have concluded that the war against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS, as well as Islamic terrorists in the West, are so significant that they must be contemplated somewhere in Bible prophecy. This point of view has sparked a renewed interest in the study of these verses, along with the 5th and 6th trumpets, as well as the last 3 plagues of Revelation chapter 16. About 3 years ago, I was invited to present what I'm going to present to you this afternoon at the Daniel 11 Study Committee at Andrews University. And when I presented this chapter that we're studying today, the master of ceremonies, or the one who was coordinating everything, whispered in my ear, and he said, this paper lays the Islam interpretation to rest. And I think you're going to see the reason why. Frequently, Ellen White has provided valuable guidance in the interpretation of difficult prophetic passages. However, unlike other portions in Daniel, Ellen White seems to be almost totally silent on Daniel 11, particularly verses 40 through 45. To my knowledge, she does not quote these verses or even echo their terminology. She never quotes the verses, and she never uses the language of Daniel 11, 40 to 45. This seeming silence has led some to conclude that Ellen White had nothing to say about these verses. We therefore ask, did Ellen White offer any interpretation of Daniel 11, 40 through 45? Or does her apparent silence indicate that the meaning of these verses would remain a mystery until long after her death? In this paper, we will seek to answer this question. And by the way, the thesis of this paper is that this is talking about the time that the papacy's deadly wound is healed. It's an expansion of Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 to 18. So there's no reason to put Islam in there. Was Islam in Daniel 2? No. Was Islam in Daniel 7? Was Islam in Daniel 8? Is Islam in Revelation 12? Is it in Revelation 13? Is it in Revelation 17? So why do we insert it in Daniel 11? It's not an expansion of anything that comes before or after. So we can't just put another power in there. But we have to expand the previous powers. So, to my knowledge, there are only 3 primary references to Daniel 11 in the published writings of Ellen White, except for one that is found in A Word to the Little Flock, which was co-authored by James and Ellen White. The first of these statements by Ellen White is indirect. The second is general, and the third is very specific. Only in the specific reference does Ellen White quote any verses from Daniel 11. Isn't that interesting? Only once in all of her writings does she quote verses from Daniel 11. And that's Daniel 11, 30 to 36, a very valuable quotation, I might say. Unfortunately, as stated above, she never quoted or even echoed the language of verses 40 to 45. So it would seem well nigh impossible to know if or how she understood these verses. The first reference is indirect. Now we're going to go through the references. The first reference is indirect because Ellen White did not mention Daniel 11 by name. However, she did allude to the chapter by mentioning the visions that God gave Daniel next to the river Ulai and the river Hiddekel. The Ulai was given in Daniel 8, and the Hiddekel in Daniel 10 and 11. This is the quotation. The light that Daniel received from God was given especially for these last days. The visions he saw by the banks of the Ulai, which, by the way, is Daniel 8, verse 2, and the Hiddekel, Daniel 10, verse 4, and chapter 11, the great rivers of Shinar, are now in the process of fulfillment, and all the events foretold will soon come to pass. So this is an indirect statement. She doesn't say Daniel 11, but she does mention the vision by the river Hiddekel. So we know that she is talking about Daniel 8, the Ulai, and Daniel 11, the Hiddekel. In the second reference, Ellen White used the expression, the 11th chapter of Daniel, but only in general terms. Here's the quotation written in 1909. By the way, the first quotation was written in 1896. This one is from 1909. This is what she wrote. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Soon, the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The third quotation of Ellen White was written in 1904, and it's the only one where she quoted any verses from Daniel 11. As I mentioned before, she quoted verses 30 to 36. This is how that statement reads. We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel, notice she mentions actually the 11th of Daniel, has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. And she continues, nearly reached its complete fulfillment. And then she adds this, much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. So the prophecy has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Daniel 11 has nearly reached its complete fulfillment when she's writing in 1904. And she says that much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. And then comes the quotation. In the 30th verse, a power is spoken of that shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And then she quotes verses 31 to 36. Well, I haven't included in the quotation because it would make the quotation too long, but she continues with verses 31 to 36. And then notice, scenes similar to those described in these words, scenes similar to those described in verses 30 to 36 will take place. Now let's take a closer look at the three references that we just mentioned. I just mentioned the references without an analysis. Now we're going to analyze them. The indirect quotation in Testimonies to Ministers 112 from 1896 does not specifically mention Daniel 11, but provides two very important details. Number one, God gave Daniel the prophecy of chapter 8 by the river Ulai, and the one in Daniel 10 and 11 by the Hiddekel. The coupling of these prophecies by Ellen White indicates that they are parallel and run concurrently. Remember we studied that Daniel 11 is an expansion of Daniel 8? Ellen White is saying that right here, even though she doesn't say Daniel 11. Therefore, Daniel 11 must be seen as an expansion of chapter 8. The second important point from this quotation is that these two prophecies were in the process of fulfillment in 1896. But Ellen White did not mention where they were in the process. Correct? She says they're in the process of fulfillment. But she doesn't say if we're at the beginning of the process, the middle of the process, or towards the end of the process. So we're left with that question. But she does say that they're in the process of fulfillment. The general quotation in Testimonies for the Church, volume 9, page 14, adds some valuable information. See, we're doing some detective work here. Some valuable information. When Ellen White wrote this testimony in 1909, she stated that the prophecy of Daniel 11 had nearly reached its complete fulfillment. So where are we in the process of fulfillment? At the very end. Because she says, has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Therefore, we can be certain that in 1909, the process of fulfillment was where? In the last few verses, because it's nearly reached its complete fulfillment. The specific quotation in Manuscript Releases, volume 13, page 394, written in 1904, contains some valuable information not found in the other two. There, Ellen White explained that much of the history of this chapter had been fulfilled before 1904, correct? She says much has already been fulfilled. And she also wrote that the history that was fulfilled would be what? Repeated. That's future. The question is, which history was she specifically referring to when she said that much of the history would be repeated? Fortunately, we don't have to guess, because she immediately quoted verses 30 to 36. So that must be the history that's going to be what? That's going to be repeated. Then, after quoting these verses, she underlined again that much of the history in these verses would occur once more, not identically, but in similar fashion. She ends the quotation by saying, scenes similar to those described in these words, that is, the past fulfillment, will take place. So far, so good? Clearly, Ellen White understood that the historical events in verses 30 to 36, as well as verses 37 to 39, which she doesn't quote, had already reached their fulfillment when she wrote, correct? Yeah, because it says much of the history in these verses was going to be repeated. So verses 30 to 36, or up to 39, had already reached their fulfillment when she wrote in 1904. Then the repetition of much of the history must occur where? You don't have to be King Solomon to understand this. If much of the history was fulfilled, verses 30 to 39, well, then when she says that much of the history is going to be repeated, the repetition has to be in verses 40 to 45. Correct? Yes? All right. Thus, verses 30 to 39 describe events that transpired before 1904, and verses 40 to 45 describe similar events in the future. The next paragraph is important. We must underline that Ellen White did not write that these verses would have a dual fulfillment, that they're fulfilled twice, one past and the other future. She wrote that much of the history that had already been fulfilled would repeat in similar fashion in the future. In other words, it is not the prophecy that will be repeated, but rather much of the history that had already fulfilled the prophecy that will be repeated. Are you following this point? She's not saying that verses 30 to 39 are going to be repeated all over again. What she's saying is that much of the details of verses 30 to 39 will be repeated, the history will be repeated in similar fashion in the future. Now we must ask why. Much of the history of the past, verses 30 to 39, will repeat in similar fashion in the future. The answer is not hard to find. Daniel 11, 30 to 39 echoes many of the character traits of the little horns in Daniel 7 and 8 and the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. History proves that the arrogant and persecuting power described in these verses is the Roman Catholic papacy, as it behaved during its 1260-year career, or during times the dividing of time, or 42 months. From 538 to 1798, this apostate system united church and state and used the sword of the civil powers of Europe to persecute dissenters, and it prospered. We already studied this, right? History reveals that at the end of the 1260 years, the papacy received what? A deadly wound, when the civil power of France turned against it in the aftermath of the French Revolution. However, prophecy indicates that this did not end the papacy's career. Revelation 13 predicts that after a period of convalescence or inactivity, its deadly wound will be healed. Revelation 13, 11 to 18 points out that the United States will heal the deadly wound by making a replica of what the papacy did in its lurid past. When the papacy recovers the sword of civil power, it will behave as it did in the past. Thus, much of the history of past papal oppression will repeat in similar fashion in the future. Are you following? So what is the past career of the King of the North? The 1260 years. What is the future stage of the little horn, or of the harlot, or of the man of sin, or of the abomination of desolation, or of the Antichrist? What is the future career? It is when the deadly wound is what? Healed. Let's see what Ellen White had to say about this. The little lady knew what she was talking about. Notice the following statement. This is Great Controversy 579. The influence of Rome, she's talking about the papacy, in the countries that once acknowledged her dominion. When was that? Once acknowledged her dominion. When was that? Oh, that was during the 1260 years, right? The influence of Rome in the countries that once acknowledged her dominion is still far from being what? Destroyed. And prophecy foretells a what? A restoration of her power. Is that going to be the future career? Absolutely. And then she quotes Revelation 13. I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. Is she right? Absolutely. The next statement is Testimonies, Volume 5, page 712. When our nation shall so abjure, that means abandon, the principles of its government, as to enact a Sunday law, Protestantism will in this act join hands with popery. It will be nothing else than what? Giving life. Why would you have to give life? Well, because the papacy was deadly wounded, right? Giving life to the tyranny which has long been eagerly watching its opportunity to what? Oh, to spring again. That's a future career, right? Into active despotism. The next statement is from Signs of the Times, June 12, 1893. Protestants will throw their whole influence and strength on the side of the papacy by a national act. What is a national act? It's an act of Congress. It's a law. It's an establishment of religion, if you please. Once again, she says, Protestants will throw their whole influence and strength on the side of the papacy by a national act enforcing the false Sabbath. They will give what? Why would they have to give life? Well, because there is no life. The papacy has a deadly wound. So once again, they will give life and vigor to the corrupt faith of Rome, reviving her tyranny and oppression of conscience. Then it will be time for God to work in mighty power for the vindication of His truth. And then we have this next statement. It is impossible to give any idea of the experience of the people of God who shall be alive upon the earth when celestial glory and a repetition of the persecutions of the past are blended. So, are there going to be future persecutions? Who's going to persecute? The papacy. What sword is the papacy going to use? The sword of the United States, the sword of civil power. And that will be a blending of the persecutions of the past and the persecutions of the future. it can hardly escape our attention that the blending of the persecutions of the past with those of the future are in the very chapter where Ellen White wrote that the prophecy of Daniel 11 has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. The statement I just read is in the chapter where Ellen White states that the prophecy of Daniel 11 has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. This is 9 Testimonies, page 14. The prophecy of the 11th chapter of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. In the light of our foregoing analysis, we can safely conclude that the scenes of the papacy's past career in verses 30 to 39 will repeat once more in similar fashion in verses 40 to 45. So far, so good? We go slow but sure. What is the key to Ellen White's view? Did Ellen White have anything to say about the events described in verses 40 to 45? The question is, where would we begin to look? If she never quotes these verses and never uses the terminology of those verses, where would you even start to look? Where could you find her comments on verses 40 to 45 if she never references the verse and she never uses the language of those verses? I believe that Daniel 12, verse 1 contains the key that unlocks Ellen White's understanding of these verses. Though she never quoted or alluded to the verbiage of Daniel 11, 40 to 45, she did quote the next 2 verses. So what do we need to do? We need to work backwards. We'll come back to that in a moment. She did quote the next 2 verses, Daniel 12, 1 and 2. As we shall see below, the place where she quoted Daniel 12, 1 and 2 in the Great Controversy unveils her understanding of the immediately preceding verses in Daniel 11, 40 to 45. Now, because Ellen White did not quote or allude to the terminology of verses 40 to 45 in the Great Controversy, we cannot work inductively from verse 40 forwards, because she doesn't quote the verses and she doesn't quote the terminology, because we don't know where to find her comments on verse 40. What we must do then is work deductively, which is what a detective does. You know, after the crime, he looks for the clues to find the culprit in back. So we must work deductively, retroactively, from Daniel 12:1 backwards. Are you understanding the method? Because if she quotes Daniel 12:1 and 2, would we expect maybe her to say something in verses 40 to 45, which come immediately before chapter 12, verses 1 and 2? Of course, we would expect it. So let's take a look at Daniel 12, verses 1 through 1 and 2. And we're going to see 4 key details here. At that time, Michael shall stand up. Okay, that's the first. The standing up of Michael, which, by the way, is the close of probation. We're going to see. Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And what happens after he stands up? And there shall what? There shall be a time of trouble, such as never once was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time of trouble, your people shall be what? That's the third element, shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall what? That's the fourth, shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So there are 4 sequential events: the standing up of Michael, the time of trouble, the deliverance of those who are written in the book, and the special resurrection. Now let's consider how Ellen G. White developed these four events in the Great Controversy, but let's do it in reverse order. Beginning with the fourth item on the list with the special resurrection and working backwards to the first element that's mentioned, which is the standing up of Michael. Are you understanding the method we're going to use? We're going to work backwards. Let's notice the fourth item. Notice Great Controversy, page 637. It's important to look at the pages because we're working backwards. Great Controversy, 637. Here, Ellen White quotes the fourth item on the list, the special resurrection. This is how it reads. Graves are opened, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. That's the fourth item on the list above, working backwards. Now let's look at the third item. What page are we talking about? 635. Do you see that we're working backwards? So a special resurrection is on page 637. Now we're going to notice a third item 2 pages before, on page 635. Ellen White described the third item on the list, the deliverance of God's people. The chapter's title, in fact, is God's People Delivered. And at the beginning of the chapter, God's people delivered, the third item on the list, she wrote this: the people of God, some in prison cells, some hidden in solitary retreats in the forest and mountains, still plead for divine protection, while in every quarter, companies of armed men, urged on by hosts of evil angels, are preparing for the work of death. It is now, in the hour of utmost extremity, that the God of Israel will interpose for what? For the deliverance of his chosen. So that's a third item. Do you suppose that the next item is a little earlier in the chapter? Well, let's notice the second item on the list. It's found in the chapter, the time of trouble. Immediately before the chapter, God's people delivered, you have the chapter on the time of trouble. And by the way, the last 2 lines in the chapter on the time of trouble anticipate the next chapter, because the last 2 lines talk about the deliverance of God's chosen. It says there, glorious will be the deliverance of those who have patiently waited for his coming and whose names are written in the book of life. So let's look at the second item, working backwards. Page 616. Are you noticing that we're moving backwards here? We've moved from page 637, the special resurrection, to page 635, the deliverance of God's people. And now the second item on page 616 is the chapter on the time of trouble. In fact, Ellen White wrote on page 616, the people of God will then be plunged into those scenes of affliction and distress described by the prophet as the time of Jacob's trouble. And then the first item on the list, working backwards. Ellen White began the chapter on the time of trouble by quoting Daniel 12, verse 1, and then explained the meaning of the standing up of Michael, which is the first item on the list. She wrote this: then Jesus ceases his intercession in the sanctuary above. When he leaves the sanctuary, darkness covers the inhabitants of the earth. In that fearful time, the righteous must live in the sight of a holy God without an intercessor. And that is on page 613. Are you seeing how we're moving backwards? Is she commenting on every item of Daniel chapter 12, verse 1? In reverse order? Absolutely. So let's summarize Ellen White's comments on Daniel 12, 1 and 2. Let's look at Ellen White's development of Daniel 12, 1 and 2 in its textual order. Now we're going to look at it in the order in which it appears in Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Great controversy 6:13, the standing up of Michael. Great controversy 6:16, the time of trouble. Great controversy 6:35, it's the end of the chapter on the time of trouble, God's people delivered. And page 637, the special resurrection. The perceptive reader will notice that Ellen White, in the Great Controversy, develops the events of Daniel 12, 1 and 2 in the precise order in which they appear in Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. So far, so good? You following it? Okay, now let's go to the next page. The expression "at that time." However, we cannot understand Daniel 12, 1 and 2 isolated from its immediately preceding context, because these verses are a continuation of events at the end of chapter 11. We know this because Daniel 12, verse 1 begins with a time reference, "at that time." This temporal expression links Daniel 12, 1 and 2 with what occurred previously in verses 40 to 45 of the 11th chapter. Are you following me or not? See, this is like detective work. You look for all the clues, and then you put them all together. So are you understanding this point? Daniel 12, verse 1 begins with a time reference. At this time. The question is, at what time? It must refer to events that happened in the previous chapter. The crucial question at this point is this: where would we expect to find Ellen White's comments about the events that will occur immediately before Daniel 12, 1 and 2? I'll give you one guess. I see Liesel. In the previous chapter. We must find them in the pages that immediately precede the chapter on the standing up of Michael. Now let's take a look at the literary structure. See, we emphasize one of the hermeneutical principles, one of the principles of interpretation, is that we need to study the structure. It's not enough to simply study the verses as they're written. You have to look how they're structured, how they're organized. So now let us consider the literary structure of verses 44b. We're going to do 44a earlier, but the structure of verses 44b through 45 to determine how they relate to Daniel 12, verses 1 and 2. The purpose is to ascertain the event to which the expression "at that time" points. A careful comparison of verses 44b, the last half of verse 44, and verse 45, with Daniel 12, verse 1, reveals that they describe the same events in the same order, but with different terminology and emphasis. So what I'm saying is that Daniel 11, verses 40, the last half of verse 44 and verse 45, have the same content as Daniel 12, verse 1, but with different language, with different terminology. So let's take a look how they relate to one another. Daniel 11, 44b, that's the last half of the verse, through verse 45, focuses on the actions and destiny of the king of the north. That's the emphasis of those verses. It focuses on the actions and destiny of the king of the north. And here it is, A, B, C. The king of the north goes out to destroy and annihilate many. That's the second part of verse 44. The king of the north sets up the tents of his palace in a strategic place between the seas and the glorious holy mountain to give a final death blow to the remnant. That's chapter 11, 45a. The king of the north comes to his end with none to help him, Daniel 11:45b. So are you seeing the three parts here? 44b, the last half of verse 44, tells us that he goes out to destroy. Then The first part of verse 45a, tells us that he sets up the tents of his palace to give a final death blow to the remnant. And then 11:45, the second half of the verse, tells us that the king of the north comes to an end with none to help him. So let me ask you, who is the central of focus here? Is it God's people? No, who's the center of focus? The king of the north. He goes out to destroy. He sets up the tents of his palace. He comes to his end with no one to help him. So this is describing the what? The actions and destiny of the king of the north. But Daniel 12:1, what it does is it focuses on the jeopardy and deliverance of the remnant from the king of the north. Notice, Michael stands up to defend his people. That's A. B, the time of trouble such as never was ensues. And C, God delivers his people from the king of the north. So we're going to explain this a little more on the next page. Daniel 11:44b through verse 45 and Daniel 12:1 are precisely parallel, but they portray different emphasis. Whereas Daniel 11:44b through 45 highlights the activities of the king of the north and its destiny for oppressing God's people, Daniel 12 verse 1 focuses on the jeopardy of God's people at the hand of the king of the north and their deliverance by God. This is the way that it operates. We're going to notice 11:44b with 12:1a. When the king of the north goes out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many, Michael will stand up to protect them. Are you with me or not still? The second line, 11:45a with 12:1b. When the king of the north places the tents of his palace in a strategic location to deliver the final death blow against the remnant, they will experience a terrible what? Time of trouble, such as never was. 11:45b with 12c, however, the king of the north will come to his end with none to help him when God intervenes to deliver his people who are written in the book. Are you with me or not? I know we had lunch, so maybe it's difficult to concentrate, but I think this is clear. One focus is the king of the north, the other focus is the remnant. So, the expression at that time thus links Daniel 11:44b through 45 with Daniel chapter 12 verse 1. God answers the actions of the king of the north by counteractions in defense of the faithful. Now you say, what about 44a? You skipped that. Well, now we need to take a look at 11:44a. What about Daniel 11:44a, the first half of the verse? The text tells us that tidings from the north and from the east will trouble the king of the north and lead him to go forth with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. So there's news that comes from the north and from the east that rattles the king of the north. It riles him. It angers him. So this is the reason why the king of the north goes out to destroy many, is because of the news that comes from the north and from the east. What is this news from the north and the east that so infuriates the king of the north? We must go to the book of Revelation for the answer, because Revelation does what? It unseals and expands upon Daniel. See, in Daniel 11, it doesn't tell you what the tidings from the north and the east are. So where do you go for the next expansion? You got a Revelation for the next expansion, because after Daniel 11, there's no expansion. The angel tried to expand, but finally Daniel didn't get it, so the angel says, Gabriel says, Daniel, just rest. And your book will be used at the time of the end so that people can understand. Now let's notice, what is this news? from the north and the east that so infuriates the king of the north? We must go to the book of Revelation for the answer, because Revelation unseals and expands Daniel. Notice this statement, or these statements from Ellen White. The first is Christ Triumphant. It's a devotional book. The books of Daniel and Revelation are one. One is a prophecy, the other a revelation. One a book sealed, and the other a book opened. In Testimonies to Ministers 1:15, the book of Daniel is unsealed in the revelation to John and carries us forward to the last scenes of this earth's history. So let's talk first of all about the news from the east. Revelation 7 verse 2 describes an angel who ascends from the east with the seal of the living God. This angel places the seal on the foreheads of those who sigh and cry. By the way, that's a loud cry. Who sigh and cry because of the abominations being committed by those who profess to serve God. In contrast, the land beast of Revelation 13, 11 to 18 will impose the mark of the beast on the unfaithful and sentence to death those who sigh and cry. Thus, the work of the sealing angel from the east will do what? It will enrage the wicked who have the mark of the beast. Is it any coincidence that the sealing angel comes from the east? Tidings from the north and from the east. What about the tidings from the north? Revelation 18, 1 through 5, vividly describes a powerful, loud cry angel who descends from heaven. What direction of the compass is heaven? It's north. You say, really? Lucifer aspired to the throne of God. Where was the throne of God? In the sides of the north. See, we usually think of the directions of the compass in linear fashion, but really north is up, south is down, east to the right hand, and west to the left hand. So in the Bible, north is the abode of God. So where are the tidings coming from? They're coming from the north, they're coming from heaven, from the east. The east is the sealing angel. What is the message that comes from the north? There's an angel that descends from heaven. He's known as the fourth angel in Revelation 18. And all the earth is enlightened by his what? Is enlightened by his glory. And makes a clarion call for the faithful to leave where? To get out of Babylon. What is Babylon? Babylon are the counterfeit churches, the unfaithful churches. And God's people are calling them to come out before the plagues fall. Escape before the plagues fall. And of course, this is going to make Babylon super happy. How is Babylon going to react? It's going to be furious. Just read Revelation 17, where this is expanded. The harlot is filled with the blood of the saints and with the martyrs of Jesus. Incidentally, do you know why the north and the east are God's points of the compass? Because that's where light originates, and light reaches its greatest intensity. Jesus was incarnated from the east. You can read it in Luke chapter 1. I think it's verse 48 and 49. Jesus is going to come from where? From the east. And what condition will the world be in at that time? In darkness. In Ezekiel chapter 48, chapter 40 through 48, once again, God comes from the east. So the east is God's point of the compass because that's where light originates. Where does the light reach its greatest intensity? At noon, when it's directly above the head. Where does darkness begin? In the west. And where does it reach its deepest intensity? In the south, the underworld. That's the reason why the beast of Revelation 11 rises from the abyss. And Satan is spoken of coming from the abyss because he is the prince of what? He is the prince of darkness. Are you following me or not? So this message, loud cry message, comes from heaven from the north, and the sealing message comes from the east. And this infuriates the king of the north. You say, how do we know that? Well, let's see what Ellen White had to say about this in the chapter, The Final Warning, where she discusses the loud cry of Revelation 18. This is in Great Controversy, page 603. She begins this chapter by quoting Revelation 18, verse 1, verse 2, verse 4, and verse 5, in perfect accordance with Daniel 11:44a. On page 605, she wrote this: while the observance of the false Sabbath, in compliance with the law of the state, contrary to the fourth commandment, will be an avowal of allegiance to a power that is in opposition to God, the keeping of the true Sabbath in obedience to God's law is an evidence of loyalty to the Creator. While one class accept the sign of submission to earthly powers, receive the mark of the beast, the other, choosing the token of allegiance to divine authority, receive the seal of God. How are the wicked going to react when this loud cry message is given? Well, we find it on the next page. Great Controversy 607. She says the power attending the message will only what? Madden those who oppose it. So what is it that causes the king of the north to be infuriated and to go and try to destroy the faithful? It's the loud cry and the sealing message. In the next chapter, Ellen White flashes back to events leading to the time of trouble. Notice what she wrote, Great Controversy 6:14 and 6:15. The power attending the last warning, that's the loud cry and the sealing message. What's going to happen as a result? Has enraged the wicked. Their anger is kindled against all who have received the message, and Satan will excite to still greater intensity the spirit of hatred and persecution. Are you with me? So is Ellen White discussing the verses of Daniel 11, verses 40 to 45? She most certainly is, but she's doing backwards. Now, in this paper, we have discussed primarily the events from Daniel 11:44 to Daniel 12, verse 2. However, if we continued moving backwards in the Great Controversy before page 603, which is the final warning, we would find in reverse order that Ellen White expanded upon each phrase of Daniel 11:40 to 45, ending with the chapter on the Bible and the French Revolution. Well, at the time of the end, the king of the south will attack the king of the north. That's a deadly wound. By the way, that chapter is Great Controversy, page 265 through page 288. Remarkably, although she does not employ the terminology of verses 40 to 45, the sequence of events clearly reveals that she is discussing them. Now you're probably wondering, why didn't she just come out and say it? There's a historical reason, but time is up. So we're going to have to take a little break and ask some questions. And in our next class, we'll conclude this chapter. Hopefully we'll have enough time to also deal with that short chapter. Did you follow what we studied? Yes. Is it clear? Did the little lady know what she was talking about? You better believe she knew very well what she was talking about because she was inspired.